All right. So at this point, I'm so happy to have Lisa Olsen with us this morning. She's with Wild Ones. She actually first started as a volunteer with Wild Ones and then working in her chapter there in Colorado, now in a professional role as a chapter liaison for the Wild Ones organization. If you don't have Wild Ones close to you, Lisa's going to tell you a little bit about Wild Ones, what they do, some of their great programs across the country. We have a really active Wild Ones presence here in Ohio, groups that are doing educational programs, demonstration, community events, plant sales, other things to really promote the importance of native plants there in local communities. So Lisa's going to talk about cultivating a community for support of native plants. Lisa, we're really happy to have you here. Also, your background in horticulture, I think, adds a really neat element to what you can teach folks about native plants. So I'll let you go ahead and share your screen, and we'll turn the podium over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Denise. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I wanted to make sure I did click that microphone. Thank you so much. Yeah, for me, Wild Ones was a great fit because of that sort of interest in horticulture experience. I love that we're able to focus on getting plants into gardens. And I was already doing that in my professional life, talking people into buying native plants. And so being able to transition into what really is in alignment with my passion has been lovely. I'm really excited that so many people are tuning in today. To see that number of registrants continue to grow week to week is cause for celebration and hope. I don't doubt that attending these sessions, listening to this series of talks, you are all going to come away with the knowledge and inspiration to make positive changes in your garden. But we live in a country of over 330 million people and on a planet with 7.9 billion other people. How do we connect and convince those folks who are not in this virtual room to join us? How do we cultivate a concern for nature? How do we scale up the actions we are taking in our own gardens and transform that into collective action, neighborhood, city, state, and nationwide action? How do we cultivate a community of support for native plants and living landscapes? Clicker didn't seem to want to work. Thank you. My name, again, is Lisa Olsen, and I am representing Wild Ones, a national supported member organization. It's a nonprofit organization working to inspire and empower people to plant native plants and adopt environmentally sound landscaping maintenance practices. Wild Ones works in the space of biocultural restoration, rekindling people's connection to and respect for the land. As an organization, we advocate for restoring biodiverse ecosystems through landscaping with native plants. To fulfill that mission, we must cultivate a value shift in ourselves and our communities through education and experience. The series, which is titled Tending Nature, Native Plants and Every Gardener's Role in Fostering Biodiversity, features an amazing lineup of speakers, leaders in their respective fields, working on the forefront of the movement towards sustainable landscaping, gardening in harmony with nature. I'm a bit of an anomaly in this lineup. I think I am coming from a perspective more akin to that of the audience. Native plants are something I discovered a passion for over time. And as a profession, it's something I sort of fell into. Full disclosure, I'm not a botanist, an entomologist. I don't have years and years of field research experience. I'm an English major, and I've worked in various service industries, and I'm a perennial student. I think that one of the silver linings of the pandemic has been this explosion of opportunities to continue education online. And I am a continuing education junkie. And I'm basically a full-time volunteer, and only recently has my work and my volunteer work and my work come into alignment. So this is me, born in 1969, the same year the Environmental Protection Agency was founded. I grew up with Give a Hoot, Don't Pollute and Smokey the Bear, and I've been riding the wave of conservation my whole life. My grandmother instilled in me and my sister a love of museums and public gardens. The photo on the right was taken by my sister a few years ago at the garden surrounding the Natural History Museum smack in the middle of downtown Los Angeles, which is a stellar example of urban habitat restoration. My family moved from Ohio to California when I was 7, and I continue to be inspired by and in awe of the natural beauty of this country. Growing up, nature was something to explore outside and on the page. Almost all of my favorite books as a child, the characters were all animals, and Disney's Bambi absolutely shaped my worldview. Man was in the forest, and those are powerful and chilling words to a child. I've always felt indebted to nature and have volunteered and worked to repair the damage we as a species has brought. Full disclosure, both my parents were librarians, so I grew up around books. Do not underestimate the power of a good story to instill the love of nature in a child. I want to pause a moment and talk just a little bit about stories and storytelling. In recent days, I've heard many references to Abraham Lincoln's talent as a strategic storyteller, which he used to persuade and sway a nation in a time of extreme unrest. Stories are how people relate to one another. We connect and find common ground through storytelling. Stories are memorable, they capture the imagination, and they inspire action. To cultivate community, to build strong and lasting relationships, you need to be willing to share your story. Think about what inspires you, why you grew up into a person who cares about insects and birds and plants. What grounds you? I encourage you to incorporate parts of your story into your stump speech when talking about native plants. We are engaged in a soft sell campaign to convince our family, friends, neighbors, colleagues, and communities to plant native plants. Sharing why you care is part of that sales pitch. What are we selling? We're selling a path to a brighter, more resilient future. At Wild Ones, we are looking to restore ecological value to degraded landscapes of all sorts, schoolyards, urban sidewalk hell strips and vacant lots, street medians and roadside ditches, strip malls, suburban and business park lawns. The list is long. As we work to restore life and create habitat in the spaces we have impacted, I encourage you to adopt a more holistic perspective, akin to and in alignment with the views held by Indigenous peoples, that of a steward rather than an owner. As both conscientious and conscious stewards, I encourage you to do your best work and work with nature to design and tend the spaces where we live. With many urban and suburban landscapes, we are looking at constructed geographies with houses for mountains, creating microclimates that wouldn't exist in nature. To fill these novel landscapes, we have the opportunity to reintroduce plants native to our region, to repair broken food webs and revive degraded soils. We are in a time and a space to do the work and create the conditions for regeneration. The photos on this slide are of the Green Vine Garden, a parking strip or hell strip garden in downtown Denver. There's also a rain garden designed to harvest runoff from the adjacent building and parking lot. That's me in the black shirt celebrating one of the few thunderstorms that rolled over us in the hot, dry summer of 2020. For gardens like these to take root, we need to cultivate community, to bring people together, whether that be in person or online, to share knowledge and tools to create the conditions that foster lasting stewardship. Last week, Doug Tallamy explained that every person on Earth bears a responsibility for good Earth stewardship. He quoted Cherokee elder Stan Rushworth. The Western mindset was, I have rights. and I should say is, I have rights. The mindset of Indigenous people is I have obligations. As I share with you today, I invite you to think not just about what lessons you can take away from today, but also consider what you can give back to the land, and what you can share with those in your community. Make no mistake, what you do in your garden is important, but what you share with others matters more. I will begin by sharing a bit about Wild Ones and then highlight some of the many opportunities and strategies we might use to expand this community of support for native plants. Wild Ones promotes environmentally sound landscaping practices to preserve biodiversity through the preservation, restoration, and establishment of native plant communities. I love that Wild Ones is rooted in continuing education. As a perennial student, I attend far more talks than I give. It's nice to know that back in 1977, the year my family moved across the country, our founders recognized the many benefits that native plants bring to a garden setting, not the least of which is a closer connection to nature. Wild Ones is a member-supported, volunteer-driven organization based in Neenah, Wisconsin. I had to wait until the last minute to add this slide because that map keeps changing. As a chapter liaison, I respond to several inquiries each week from folks expressing interest in forming a new chapter in their region. If you live near a local chapter, please consider joining. If you live in a region where Wild Ones has yet to take root, I encourage you to reach out and we can chat about launching a seedling chapter. I love those conversations because I get to talk to my fellow plant peeps. Membership dues support chapter activities and the many free resources that we find on the Wild Ones website, and links to both the website and this map of chapters and how to start a chapter are on that OSU Tending Nature webpage. In 2021, Wild Ones launched a series of native garden designs available to download for free on our website. Currently, we have designs for Boston, Chattanooga, Chicago, Denver, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, St. Louis, Tallahassee, and Toledo. The Native Garden Designs website and the Native Garden Design Guide were supported by a grant from the Stanley Smith Horticultural Trust. This year, Wild Ones has been awarded a second grant. We're very excited to expand the program. The focus will be on designing for resilience in the face of climate change. Wild Ones hosts programs with the designers that include live Q&A sessions. Recordings of past programs are on the YouTube channel. Some of our designers are active educators in their communities. Kenton Seth, who did the design for Denver, offered Front Range chapter members and volunteers an opportunity for hands-on learning about bare root planting this past May at Englewood's Depot Prairie Park. Membership dues support Wild Ones free educational webinars. Our next webinar features Wild Ones Honorary Lifetime Director and Prairie Ecologist Neil Dybel, speaking about genetic diversity and plant preservation. Last week, Doug Tallamy spoke about the importance of planting genetic variability to ensure resilience in our landscapes in this increasingly volatile climate. This program will be a deep dive into what that looks like. Wild Ones supports youth engagement with native plants. Named for Lifetime Honorary Director Lori Otto, the Wild Ones Seeds for Education program is a donor-funded program and is designed to connect youth with nature through the planning, planting, and caring for native plant gardens. This learn by doing approach to education not only gets more native plants in the ground, it cultivates a new generation of mindful land stewards. Wild Ones publishes a quarterly journal rich with a variety of articles on native plants, emerging research, member and public gardens, restoration projects, chapter programs and activities, book reviews, and more. Members receive a digital copy of the journal and via their email, and an archive of past journals is available for public viewing on the national website. Another useful resource you will find on the national website is a list of nurseries and seed sources that sell native plants. Thankfully, that list is growing. If you have a favorite nursery or seed supplier that is not listed, please visit our website to submit your recommendation. Many nurseries support Wild Ones as business members and are listed in the journal. A couple of nursery owners have actually founded chapters. Wild Ones is educating and cultivating their customer base and driving the demand for native plants, so the business member relationship is mutually beneficial. Another useful resource I want to move on to the chapters because while we at the national level, we're a small staff and I join remotely from Colorado, we offer support and resources and guidance. The chapters really are the heart of the Wild Ones organization and community. Chapters are where community is cultivated and where we see the greatest impact. We are stronger if we connect with one another and collaborate to move the mission forward. And this photo is of the members of the Gibson Woods chapter in Indiana at the start of their annual native plant sale, probably pre-pandemic, looking at the photo. Native species can be hard to find at nurseries. Many chapters host plant sales to boost availability of native plants in their region. Public outreach is a big part of what Wild Ones chapters do. Tabling booths at home and garden shows, Earth Day, and harvest festivals, and other community events is a lot of fun and is how we connect with people who are new to gardening for wildlife. This is where you get to share your passion and your story. And this photo is actually of me this past October tabling at a native seed swap. I love touring public gardens. Last week, Matthew Ross, Wild Ones board member and director of continuing education at the world-renowned Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania, presented on America's public gardens, highlighting some of the amazing gardens across the country that have embraced native plants. And that recording is also available on YouTube. Many of our chapters arrange guided tours of public gardens. You learn a ton from horticulturists who have killed way more plants than you ever will. Chapters' summer calendars are usually feature at least a couple tours of member gardens. Nature is constantly evolving, and these gardens are typically works in progress. I remind garden tour hosts that people don't relate to perfection. Attendees are eager to learn about the process and both the triumphs and the missteps. Because of space limitation, registration for these tours is often a member benefit. Many chapters host wildflower walks in the summer months, although I know a few chapters that bundle up and go out in the winter, maybe not to look at wildflowers, but they're out there. These events provide an opportunity to observe plants' preferences and tolerances when it comes to growing conditions. You also see which plants grow well together. Nature is the best teacher, and it's good to spend time in her outdoor classroom. A lot of volunteer hours go into planning and scheduling chapter educational programs covering a wide array of topics. I hesitate to highlight any one chapter's programs because they all do an amazing job, but I did happen to discover that the Kettle Moraine chapter has an online program on lichens in April that I am very tempted to register for because I have never taken a class on lichens, and I've taken a bunch of photos, but I really know nothing about lichens. So that one is definitely on my radar. Chapters are eager to return to in-person programs, but I expect many, if not most, will continue to offer some online. The Southeastern Pennsylvania chapter launched just ahead of the pandemic, and founder Jesse Schiffler hosted all of the meetings virtually. If you have a surplus of time and are keen to learn about native plants, check out the many Wild Ones chapters YouTube channels. Some of our chapters host annual conferences or symposiums. Often these events are fundraisers that support grant programs and other chapter activities. A few events coming up are the 25th anniversary Toward Harmony with Nature conference, hosted by the Wild Ones Fox Valley area chapter on January 29th, so very soon from shortly. And then also the Landscaping with Colorado Native Plants conference is coming up. It's co-presented by the Front Range chapter on February 26th. And the Plant Natives 2022 symposium hosted by the Tennessee Valley chapter is on March 12th. And links to those events are also on the OSU webpage. And I do apologize to any chapters whose events I have failed to mention. Chapters are where you get your hands dirty. Several chapters have active propagation groups. Some engage in native plant salvage operations. These can occur in spaces slated for development or thinning out unwelcome volunteers in member gardens. These plants typically find homes in public demonstration gardens or are adopted at native plant exchanges or sharing events. Many chapters organize phenomenal plant sales in the spring, sometimes in the fall, and sometimes both. These fundraisers are fabulous opportunities to buy locally sourced native plants. Among our members, Wild Ones boasts an amazing level of expertise. At a demo day or other hands-on learning event, gardeners with years and in many cases decades of experience growing and tending native plants share their wealth of knowledge and skill with novice gardeners. This exchange of resources for services mimics nature. In exchange for the sweat equity, volunteers learn best practices and avoid costly mistakes. As Doug Tallamy pointed out last week, most of the land in the United States is privately owned, but that does not mean that the majority of people in this country own land. Many, many people face social and institutional and financial barriers to owning property. And there are some people who aren't interested in putting down roots. With that in mind, many, if not most, of Wild Ones chapters support projects in public spaces to enable broader participation. Native seed collections are my favorite. Wild Ones chapters tap into nature's abundance and harvest our gardens' bounty, which helps ensures our community's capacity to recover from the devastating effects of wildfires, floods, and tornadoes. We collect seeds with permission from both private and public spaces. I love knowing and sharing the stories of the seeds I collect, and I get to do that at native seed swaps. The model for seed exchange events varies from chapter to chapter, but basically these are pay it forward events. You get native seeds for little or no cost, and then in a year or two, you offer a return on that investment by sharing your seeds with others. I've pointed to some of the many ways that Wild Ones chapters engage with and support their members and the public. But how do we grow as a community? We need to expand this community of support for native plants in order to enact the change that we want to see, the change we need to see. We are living in a time of crisis on a global scale. In 2015, the United Nations approved a set of 17 Sustainable Development Goals to provide a globally accepted roadmap for addressing many of the most urgent economic, environmental, and social challenges. While we engage in outreach, odds are whoever we are connecting with is working towards one or more of these goals. While this patchwork of icons looks pretty, I think this pyramid graphic is a better depiction of those goals. All of the goals are incredibly important, and there's no denying that the biosphere is the foundation, with everything depending upon it. If the biosphere is not healthy, we are looking at ecosystem collapse at a global scale. But when this stacked, with these goals stacked as a pyramid, you will notice that goal number 17, partnerships for the goals, is missing. Likely that is because forging partnerships is necessary in order to achieve all of the other goals. I love that the icon that represents partnerships is in the shape of a flower. In fact, it resembles Colorado's state flower, the Colorado blue columbine. Columbines are notoriously promiscuous, and let's take a cue from nature and seize this opportunity for open pollination. The journal questions posed for this week on the OSU Tending Nature Learn With Us page, and Denise has mentioned that page as a expanded learning opportunities, places to go for learning opportunities. She posed some questions, and for this week she said, what organizations, associations, or groups focus on native plants and or biodiversity in your community, in person, online, or both? How could you join or foster the creation of such a group? Now, not that I don't want you to consider joining Wild Ones or another mission-aligned organization, or both. I'm a member of many such groups, but this is an instance in which we need to learn from nature. We can't afford to specialize and only join and communicate with organizations that support native plants and pollinators. We cannot be the small carpenter bee that Mary Gardner talked about, a solitary bee that never leaves or never flies beyond the borders of a single yard. We need to be generalists, and we need to be the honeybee and dominate the landscape. If we want to achieve widespread transformation of our landscapes, we need to think more broadly about who our allies are and who we are connecting with. We need to spread the pollen of our message widely and sow seeds of change across the country. If we work together, we don't just survive, we thrive. In 1943, psychologist and humanist Abraham Maslow introduced his theory of a hierarchy of needs to explain human motivation. If a person lacks basic physiological needs, food, shelter, clean water, the plight of pollinators, and global ecosystem collapse, these are questions that are not going to be front of mind. That said, in nature, healthy ecosystems meet those needs. We need to collaborate with and support organizations that are working to meet the needs, those primary needs of members of our communities. The events of 2020 shone a spotlight on food security in this country. Let's look for opportunities to engage with organizations addressing hunger, food swamps, and food deserts. Connect with local permaculture and homesteading groups. Community gardens are great places to introduce native plants. One project that my local chapter got involved in this summer on an urban farm / community garden, one of the gardeners commented that we were wasting time, energy, and space by planting pretty flowers. And that was a teaching moment. And as the Wild Ones volunteer explained that the native plants we were planting would attract and support both pollinators and beneficial insects that would boost the productivity of the adjacent vegetable plots. There's enough space to feed both insects and people. Native plants form the foundation of indigenous peoples' diets. Today, tribal communities are plagued by high rates of diabetes and other chronic diseases due to poor nutrition. For generations, policies of assimilation banned not only tribal languages and traditions, but also the consumption of indigenous foods. This is a quote from The Power to Heal Diabetes, Food for Life in Indian Country. Quote, "The answer to diabetes prevention may lie in our age-old food traditions. Food is the medicine that will help us reclaim our health," end quote. There is a strong connection between native plants and indigenous foodways. Planting native plants isn't just about saving bees and butterflies. People are a part of the ecosystem too. There is an opportunity to collaborate with and support organizations that are working to restore health to members of tribal communities. The number of people impacted by housing insecurity swelled in 2020. Municipalities have been struggling for decades and continue to struggle with how best to serve the unhoused population. Let's consider partnering with organizations like Habitat for Humanity, which has chapters across the country, or other homeless outreach and advocacy groups working locally, such as Earthlinks in Denver. Earthlinks creates opportunities through Earth-centered programs that enable individuals experiencing homelessness and poverty to, quote, "step out of isolation and into community, restoring each other and the planet," end quote. There are opportunities to collaborate collaborate on activities and events that will improve access to native plants and the wildlife those plants attract in underserved communities. I'm just going to pause for a moment. The number of people impacted by, many diverse organizations are tackling issues of environmental justice, including poor air quality, lead poisoning, and accessibility and equity in urban parks and tree canopies. There is space for us to join the conversation and collaborate with organizations working to address these critical issues. Native plants are our allies in this work and have the power to clean up our messes. In April, Wild Ones National Board member, Ozark Chapter founder, and environmental scientist Eric Fuselier is presenting a series of 3 webinars diving deeper into phytoremediation and green infrastructure, a topic he introduced in our December webinar. The topics include stormwater, air quality, and soil contamination. People discover a passion for native plants through many diverse paths. In the West, we see economic drivers. People want to save money on their water bills. Others are motivated by their love of birds. Some are beekeepers, some love foraging. It's imperative that we listen and identify where those passions connect and enable collaboration to achieve mutual goals and benefits. One example I like to point to is that of Wild Ones member Marcia Plucker. Marcia designed an amazing do-it-herself garden for her grandchildren to enjoy after reading How to Raise a Wild Child. Over time, Marcia has added more and more native species, attracting a greater diversity of bees, butterflies, birds to the garden. The children's playhouse at the back corner of the garden was built entirely out of salvaged materials. Marcia's primary motivation wasn't to benefit pollinators or the planet. She wanted to create a space for her grandchildren to connect with nature close to home. Many parents are looking to do this for their children as kids are forced to spend more time online due to disruptions to in-classroom learning as a result of the pandemic. Let's connect with mom and dad groups and share how native plants attract wildlife to home gardens. Let's cultivate a generation of passionate and dedicated lizard hunters like Doug Tallamy's granddaughter. How teachers had the time to invest into school gardens these past 2 years is beyond me. But the trend to incorporate outdoor learning into school curriculums has held strong. There are certainly opportunities to share with both teachers and students the fundamental role that native plants play in sustaining life on this planet. As students push college campus administrations to reduce pesticide and herbicide use through initiatives like Herbicide-Free Campus and Bee Campus USA, which is an initiative of the Xerces Society, there is space to join the conversation and educate groundkeepers, students, and faculty on the importance of native plants when attracting and achieving a balance with beneficial insects, pollinators, birds, and other wildlife. Many faith communities and service organizations are joining the discussion and taking action towards conservation. One such example is Rotary. In June of 2020, Rotary leadership unanimously voted to add supporting the environment as an area of focus, joining peace building and conflict prevention, disease prevention and treatment, water, sanitation and hygiene, maternal and child health, basic education and literacy, and community economic development. So all those other goals I mentioned before, Rotary was engaged in those, but now the environment is part of their agenda. Sacred Grounds is a National Wildlife Federation program that recognizes congregations, houses of worship, and faith communities who both create wildlife habitat and actively link faith practices and caring for the environment. If you belong to a community that is exploring ways to better steward the environment, encourage them to consider incorporating native plants into their objectives and landscapes. Faith communities water an awful lot of non-functional turf grass in this country. Native plants lend a sense of place to residential developments. Encourage your city planner or HOA to incorporate more native plants into parks and open space alongside public pathways. If you are unable to make headway, consider joining your HOA's board. Policies are shaped by those who show up. Many prairie plants co-evolved with fire, and prescribed burns simulate the conditions under which prairies regenerate. I suspect that communities along Colorado's Front Range will be taking a closer look at the role of fire in healthy grassland ecosystems in the wake of the recent devastating Marshall Fire. These photos are of a development called Prairie Crossing in Northeast Illinois, the birthplace of the Wild Ones Lake to Prairie chapter. If you wish to transform the landscaping policies and practices of your municipality or parks department, take time to meet with them in person. Share your story, share why you care. Elected officials represent people, not pollinators. They are more apt to respond to stories about the positive impact that native plants and habitat gardens have on people. If you see transformations taking place in your communities, take time to thank the representatives and staff that made that happen. Officials tend to only hear from constituents when there is a problem. They desperately need to hear from positive feedback from us when they implement policies and practices that support healthy ecosystems. In December of 2019, I had an opportunity to explore part of the Habitat Garden exhibit at the Smithsonian Gardens on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The expansive habitat exhibit, which was across approximately 50 acres, included medians of roadside native plantings, water sources, pollinator gardens, a monarch way station, and a variety of snags, insect hotels, and other habitat features. It was wonderful to see this transformation of what is essentially America's front yard. The Habitat exhibit is now on tour across the country and is currently on display at The Works, Ohio Center for History, Art, and Technology in Newark, Ohio. In the most recent journal issue, Wild Ones business member Erin Michael invited fellow native plant enthusiasts to contact the Biden administration and show support for native landscaping on the grounds of the White House, the People's House. I've shared a link to send an email message to the White House on the resources webpage. Habitat gardens can be a source of civic pride. The vision and desire for a butterfly garden and pollinator garden in Antigua, Wisconsin, a community of about 8,000, prompted the formation of the Wild Ones Northwoods Gateway chapter and a whirlwind of fundraising and volunteer opportunities, resulting in a beautiful garden in the shape of a butterfly. This new community resource is within easy reach and walking distance of 2 grade schools, a senior residence, hospital, several healthcare facilities, and community baseball fields. One man's trash is another man's treasure. Gardens can be installed on a shoestring budget using recycled and salvaged materials. The story of the Greenverine garden that I mentioned at the start of the talk resonates with anyone who is passionate about recycling. And I raise my hand. I'm part of that tribe. Many people were stuck at home in 2020 and many tackled landscape projects. This resulted in an abundance of free materials, tree stumps, river rock, pea gravel, squeegee, fill dirt, and urbanite, which is broken concrete. Volunteers collected materials and installed the hardscape elements of the garden for next to nothing. Donors were pleased to be rid of unwanted materials and happy to support a native plant demonstration garden. Solar farms and solar gardens run more efficiently when paired with plants that moderate the temperature around the panels. Native plants thrive with little or no additional inputs and add minimal cost to a solar farm. Minnesota was the first state to adopt voluntary pollinator-friendly solar farm standards in 2016, with a scorecard laying out benchmarks for biodiversity, native plants, and blooming seasons. If solar farms are sprouting up in your region, reach out and suggest a pivot to a pollinator-friendly garden. Solar garden. Green roofs, green or living roofs are another challenging space where native plants can thrive. If green roofs are trending in your area, reach out to the living architecture community and suggest adding native plants to current projects and future designs. Many corporations are implementing sustainability plans and exploring ways to lighten their carbon footprints. Transforming water-guzzling corporate campuses, all those lawns to native landscapes, is both good for the planet and good for the bottom line. Farmers and researchers in regenerative and organic agriculture point to the benefits of incorporating native species into windbreaks and hedgerows and interplanting and underplanting with native species to attract beneficial insects and sometimes yield secondary income in the form of pasture forage or native seeds. Some years ago at a pollinator summit I attended, I learned about a program in eastern Colorado that caught my attention because of what appeared on the surface to be unlikely partners that were involved. Quoting from the Pheasants Forever website, quote, "Corners for Conservation is a partnership between Pheasants Forever, farmers, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Natural Resources Conservation Service, High Plains Land Conservancy, and Muley Fanatics to create habitat for birds, bees, bucks, and butterflies that helps farmers make their land more profitable and gives the public open space access for hunting. What a win for everyone, especially the wildlife, end quote. The fact that pheasant and mule deer hunters were potential allies for pollinator conservation was an eye-opener. Funding from Pheasants Forever chapters pays for 5 critical components of this unique partnership: equipment, labor, seed, landowner incentives, and outreach. Farmers use the center pivot irrigation will convert those awkward to irrigate corners, those 7 to 8 acres per corner, into lush wildlife habitat with walk-in public access for hunters. The hunters needed access. Land in this region is 98% privately owned. The program invested in 2 no-till drills, which are used to seed over 1,600 acres each year with a diverse mix of native species. Programs like this serve as a model for what's possible when you think more broadly about who to include in your community of support for native plants. And just an update, since then, I'm doing this research for this program, I recognize that Pheasants Forever is leveraging its success with Corners for Conservation. In February of last year, in 2021, they launched a $500 million national campaign to cultivate the next generation of conservationists, enhance over 9 million acres of upland habitat. They project to permanently protect 75,000 acres of land. They should be on our list, our growing list, I should say, of allies. Speaking of campaigns, I should share that Wild Ones is not a political organization, but our members and chapters do engage in policy advocacy. Public policies reflect the values of the people. Many are outdated and fail to adequately address the current climate and biodiversity crises, as well as economic, social, and racial inequities. If policy advocacy is an arena that you are or wish to engage in, I encourage you to reach out to the Wild Ones team of volunteer wild lawyers. The link to contact them is also on that Tending Nature page. The lawyers, they can't represent you in a case or speak on your behalf, but they are in a position to offer their working knowledge of policy revisions and interpretations, and they can also offer some guidance. Not everyone out there loves the look of a native habitat garden. We get a lot of questions about how to respond to and advocate for changes to local weed ordinances. This March, join volunteer wild lawyer, Iowa attorney, and business professor Razan Plant as she explains what to do if the weed police knock on your door. Cultivating community, building relationships with organizations and individuals takes time. Be mindful of that the relationship you build is reciprocal, and be sure to cash in on your investment. Invite people you connect with to share their story more broadly with the community. Stories can be shared online, via social media, or virtual programs, or in person. The pandemic has limited people's capacity to connect. Marcia Plucker, whose garden I highlighted earlier, hasn't been able to host another garden tour or attend events, but she has collected and donated seeds from her garden. Be sure to identify and share diverse opportunities for engagement. I find that most members of this community are extremely generous. And I'm not talking about money, although in many cases that is also true. I'm talking about time and expertise and labor and plants and seeds. Like nature, gardeners are givers. Be sure to provide opportunities for people to give back. I would be remiss not to mention a few obvious allies in this work to build support for native plants and natural landscaping. Native plant nursery owners and staff, botanic garden staff, nature center and public land staff, extension agents, university faculty, and many landscape designers are well positioned and eager to share their knowledge. We need to give them an opportunity to speak by organizing programs, hikes, and tours, and introducing them to new audiences. And speaking of connecting with new audiences, marketing campaigns like the Missouri Prairie Foundation's Grow Native program, the Plant Virginia Natives Marketing Partnership, Resource Central's Garden in a Box, and Plant Select in the Rocky Mountain region do a wonderful job educating consumers about the importance of incorporating native plants into home landscapes. While neither Garden in the Box or Plant Select exclusively promote native plants, the native species that are in those programs have gained traction and are enjoying mainstream demand, while others have not. Many Front Range residents discover native plants through these two well-publicized and popular programs. A solid marketing campaign helps shift public aesthetic perceptions and drive up the demand for native plants, prompting nurseries to grow more native species. To generate widespread support for native plants, we need to shift that aesthetic. To do that, we need the plants. We need them planted in demonstration gardens. We need them growing in front of our libraries and our synagogues and along the expressway and in the Costco parking lot. We need them in our gardens. We need them in public gardens. People need to see these plants in home and public spaces in order to recognize their beauty and deem them desirable rather than weedy. To generate widespread support for native plants and natural landscapes, gardens have to be pretty. Many native plants are highly adaptable and show well in both naturalistic and formal gardens. Many excel at providing year-round interest. Many landscape features, boulders, rock walls, crevices, containers, and water features are critical habitat elements, but they can also be highly decorative. Attention to these elements invites a connection with Rock Garden Society and the Cactus and Succulent Society and all manner of mainstream garden clubs. Writer and botanist Susan J. Twite recommends designing to reflect the terroir of a flavor of a place. We live in a country of migrants. Many people move across states multiple times in their lifetimes. There is a tendency to want to plant what is familiar, and not what is native. A big part of shifting aesthetic perceptions is introducing the public to locally sourced materials. When designing a native plant garden, choose elements and plants that are evocative of the region. Gardens should look like they belong in a space. If you live in the Rocky Mountains, use rocks from the region in the garden. Look to the natural world around you for design inspiration. I want to mention the important role that signage plays in generating support for native plants. Messaging matters. When your neighbors look askance at the logs and branches in your yard, put a sign up that demonstrates that what you're doing in your garden is intentional. Wild Ones, the National Wildlife Federation, and Audubon Rockies, they all have garden certification programs that have signs. Both the California Native Plant Society and the Xerces Society, which focuses on the conservation of invertebrates, they have signs in Spanish. Other local organizations have garden certification programs, and there are loads of signs on Etsy. Signs go a long way towards educating and engaging your neighbors. I'm convinced that there is a segment of the population that cannot survive without their smartphones, and it's not just kids. I openly admit that the internet is my favorite gardening tool, but I'm not tethered to it. I think some people are. To enable those folks to dig deeper, include a QR code on your signs, linking back to your local Wild Ones website. or your YouTube channel or other resources, or perhaps link to a blog post about your garden or a plant list that they can download. QR codes are a cheap way to facilitate learning and connect people to your organization and its mission. Garden signage prompts people to slow down, learn, and observe. Signs passively educate people, but they can also prompt action, focusing attention towards a particular plant or feature, cultivating a closer connection to nature. I recently chatted with Kimberly Simon, owner of KMS Native Plant Nursery on Long Island. There's a lot of plant activity happening on Long Island at the moment. I really hope we could establish a Wild Ones chapter there soon. Kimberly shared something that I wanted to share with you. And first, she shared a story, how her customers are amazed at the hum and buzz of life they find when they visit her garden and her nursery. But she also shared a story about a neighbor. This neighbor regularly and liberally sprays pesticides to control who knows what in their garden. When this neighbor asked if he could purchase some of the plants, some native plants from her, she refused. She said, and I'm paraphrasing, "If I sell you these shrubs, pollinators will come, insects will come, birds will come, and then you will spray and they will all die. And if you stop spraying, I will sell you the plants, but only if you stop spraying." The neighbor did not stop spraying, and Kimberly didn't make the sale. And that's why I wanted to share this story. First, it's a good teaching moment. And second, it echoes Mary Gardner's point that pesticides are detrimental to healthy ecosystems and we need to stop spraying. But it also points to our values. At Wild Ones, we recognize that people are on a spectrum of familiarity with native plants. Some folks are brand new to gardening and know nothing about plants, native or otherwise, while others are seasoned botanists with decades of field experience and gardens with native plants that are native to their precise location. As a community, we welcome anyone who wants to learn and share. But as individuals, it's okay for your values to shape your personal codes, your standards. And I've been hunting for the right word to describe, and it's eluding me. And standards isn't quite right, but I can't find the right word. If you are a designer that only wants to design, install, or maintain 100% native shortgrass prairie gardens, make that your business model and part of your mission and marketing. I think the clients who share that vision and want to pay for your services, they will find you. Share those standards and message them as a specialty, as a selling point. I think in many regions, maybe not most, maybe not all, but in many regions, industry professionals can now afford to be the specialist bee. A few years ago, I attended a workshop in Southern California on yard transformations to native landscaping. The instructor was a landscape designer who worked in San Diego, and she said something that has stuck with me. She said that she wanted to make an impact in her community. She wanted to see the necessary shift to more ecologically sound landscaping in her lifetime. So she changed her business model. She only designs front yards. She might do entire properties, but she won't take a backyard project. She said that in her community, for every one front yard transformation within a year or two, 4 more households on or near that street followed suit. People need to see the change to make the change. They need to be inspired. For her, it made great business sense. Design a beautiful, water-wise garden full of native plants that people see every day driving through the neighborhood, and the more people will want one. This is a solid example of what's good for the environment is good for the economy. While the call for action is urgent and the time feels ripe, native plants are trending on TikTok after all. I urge you to practice a little patience. People respond and act in different ways and in their own time. Lifetime Wild Ones member Betty Jo Page told me that it took hearing Doug Tallamy 3 times hearing him speak 3 times, and this was pre-pandemic, so he made at least 3 trips to Denver before she realized that he was talking to her, and that she recognized that there were changes she could make on her property in her front yard to better support the ecosystem. Betty Jo is a lifelong organic gardener and educator. You would expect her to run headlong into habitat gardening, and she has, but it took time. Under the pressures of the pandemic, people are stretched thin, more so than ever before in my lifetime. I think it wise to be mindful of that and to practice both grace and patience when reaching out to build this community. Not everyone will have the capacity to respond, but don't be afraid to ask. The worst that can happen is someone says no. In my experience, more often than not, the answer is yes. This community is like a garden. It needs tending. Exercise your observational skills and pay attention when you talk to people. Listen for opportunities to collaborate and contribute. And don't be afraid to ask for help. If you do have the capacity to volunteer, to share your passion, time, and skills, I encourage you to raise your hand and reach out. Organizations like Wild Ones depend on volunteers to move the mission forward. If you love event planning, or if you are a social media maven, or a graphic designer or web designer, if you're a good writer, or a talented photographer, none of these skills require a green thumb, and all of them come in very handy when cultivating and connecting a community. All of these programs and activities and resources that chapters are running, they don't organize and produce themselves. Of course, if you are a gifted grower, we need you too. Most of all, we need people who are willing to share their passion with others, through posts, print, photos, and through person-to-person dialogue. What can you give? How can you serve? How can you best support this growing community? And we are growing like the perennial plants that sleep, creep, and then leap in our gardens. This community has taken root and planted seeds and is now flourishing. We can now say with conviction that native plants are no longer the fringe, but they are the future of landscaping. And with that, I would love to address some questions, and I will move to my contact information, which you are welcome to reach out to. And I'm going to try and unshare. Well, maybe I'll leave that screen on for just a little bit.
Sure, that's fine. Thank you, Lisa, so much. Folks, I see lots of you are putting thank yous in the chat box. I appreciate that. We ran over a little, but I let Lisa go. We lost a few minutes in with some tech issues. But I also put the link, the direct link there in the chat box. A few places it's still, you'll have to scroll up. That's the link to all the resources that Lisa compiled, the information about laws and ordinances, some of the webinars coming up. Many of you put in the chat box you were interested in the in Neil Diebold's webinar and other webinars. All that is on that resource that Lisa offered to us, and it's also on our Learn With Us page. So where all of our readings are, you'll find her whole list of resources. So again, Lisa, thank you. Lots of really great ideas and projects, places. I love the idea of stories. I think that stories really get people engaged. Let's take a few questions. Do you have suggestions for what can be incorporated into vegetable gardens, native plants?
It's going to vary from region to region. So I would lean heavily on those plants that are just pollinator magnets. In my region, there's a plant, it's not the prettiest plant out there, and it has one of those really unfortunate names called curly cup gumweed. Oh my gosh, I was at a native seed collection, and this plant was, growing out there, just doing its thing. And it was so distracting. I mean, it was covered with species, and it isn't just because the seeds, well, the flowers are kind of sticky. I mean, it wasn't like the bugs were just getting stuck to the plant. I mean, it was a magnet of all kinds of pollinators, bees, beetles, everybody was on that plant. So I would do a little digging in terms of which plants are just hands down going to be the magnets for pollinators. And definitely check out Heather Holmes' resources for that. She's got some great plant lists on who goes to what. You might want to, maybe for a community garden situation, if you got little kids, maybe don't lean so heavily on the plants that attract bees, but go for the ones that are going to attract the flies and the other critters that maybe are less intimidating for really young children. That would be my suggestion.
Okay. You mentioned some library book titles related to native plants and insect biodiversity. Is that on the resource list that you shared, or can you, if you can pass titles on to me, I can add that to
I think the only one that I didn't put on the list was the How to Raise a Wild Child. Okay. That was actually written by someone affiliated with the Natural History Museum here in Denver. So it was kind of a locally produced book. That may have been why it was on her radar. There were so many books out there, though, that speak to nature engagement now and how critical it is. But also Doug Tallamy's books, if you haven't read them, do. If you haven't watched last week's webinar, do, because, oh my gosh, I've heard him speak a bunch of times and I still learned a bunch from his talk. But yeah, the other thing I didn't mention, again, child of librarians, are chapters that are looking at seed libraries as a potential way to incorporate native plants into broader communities, because there are many seed libraries that offer vegetable seeds. But they don't all have native seeds. And so one of the focuses for this year in our collecting locally was to get some of those easy to grow species, the ones that just produce and produce and produce seeds. Like you don't know what to do with all the seeds. And if they drop on the ground, you're going to regret it, because then you will have a forest of Rocky Mountain bee plant and you won't be able, to see out of your yard. So you'll get one of those weed ordinances tickets. So
can you talk about the seed sharing? Because that was actually one of the questions. And I think there's a big misconception that you're not legally allowed to share seeds. So do you want to talk about the seed sharing and seed catalog?
Well, to be honest, there are rules. There are rules and regulations. We are not selling seeds. I'm going to make that very, very clear. These are free events. That said, gardeners donate, and it's been really rewarding to see how much people are supportive of these events. But, it is sort of an honor system. We do sort of say, to the best of our knowledge, these are the species that have been collected, because we are relying on novices to collect many of the seeds. We do get some amazing diversity from some of those people I mentioned in that horticulture realm who also have amazing gardens. They've donated an amazing diverse array of species. At this past year's event, we had over 180 native species represented throughout the season of native seeds, which I find astounding. I think that's just amazing. But the intention is not to sell these seeds. These are not seeds that are being purchased by or taken by industry professionals. These are home gardeners that are coming to take seeds, try their hand at growing them out themselves, leaning on propagation groups for resources to get those seeds growing. That said, there are some rules as far as the seed libraries go, and it doesn't hurt to check with your local USDA office and see what those rules are. I know the Boulder Public Library has an envelope that they've sort of pre-printed saying, this is what the species is. We do ask that people include like the location of the collection. The date is very critical. In our area, we ask they include the elevation. I know that's not a thing in most of the country, but in our part, it's a big deal as to whether a plant was grown at 5,000 or 10,000 feet. And so we want people to indicate that on the seeds that they submit to the swaps and to the seed share events. And that way, if you're looking to adopt seeds, you're finding the most geographically relevant and the plants that are just going to do the best adapted to your elevation, your region.
There were several questions about, so maybe we can wrap up here with folks who are, maybe they just learned about Wild Ones from you. They'd like to find out about chapters. How do they get a list of those chapters? And also, is there anything happening in Canada? We have quite a few participants from Canada, and they want to know, how can they get
I
involved here?
know we get a lot of questions about Canada. Our friends to the north. Wild Ones is currently only registered to, do business. I mean, we don't really do business, but that's what we're licensed to do as an educational nonprofit in the United States. So we don't currently have members. Well, that's not true. We have members in Canada, but they join as partners at large. They aren't. We can't start chapters in Canada at the moment. That will take some time to work through those hurdles. Quite honestly, we're still jumping through the state hurdles because every state is different. So the number of every time a chapter pops up in a new state, and this week that was Virginia. Hello, southeastern Chesapeake. That was Monday. So we have chapters popping up, and some experience a slow start. Others take off like wildfire, and it really, I think, depends on the person who starts it as to whether or not they are a wallflower or a butterfly. if they're going to talk to everybody they ever met about native plants, that chapter is going to take off quickly. But there's no time limit as far as starting a chapter goes. The list of chapters you asked is on the chapters tab on the website. So if you go to the homepage and just click chapters, up pops that map. And yes, it does keep changing. This week we did, week plus one day, we've had 2 chapters launched, both one in Virginia and another, our third in Pennsylvania.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. And I think you got a couple few new members. I see that Mary just joined the Ann Arbor group. So,
very nice.
Yeah.
Ann Arbor's a great group.
So thanks again for putting your presentation together, for gathering lots of different ideas and programs and projects to share with us, to get us thinking a little bit beyond just the plant. How do we pull the people piece in?